American chattel slavery is unique in its own way, but like any other topic, it needs some context to be discussed accurately. The transatlantic slave trade ensured massive numbers of sub-Saharan Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the east coast of a rapidly developing colonial America. But the overwhelming majority of slaves can be found here in the American South, specifically within what's known as the Bible Belt. And while the first enslaved Africans arrived in the New World sometime near 1619, the most commonly known slaveholding period that most Americans think of is the Antebellum period. We'll stop in the year 1850 as a landmark point. This term, antebellum, when translated from Latin, roughly means before the war, and in this American context, you should be thinking of the time period of growing tensions between the North and the South. If you've ever read about figures like Harriet Tubman, John Brown, or Frederick Douglass, then you're probably talking about the antebellum period. Also, for the sake of context, we should look at the type of socioeconomic landscape we visit when we're discussing the Antebellum South. Now, we can see our total population of 23 million, but more relevant here is its black population, sitting at 3.6 million by the time we reach 1850. Now, most Americans relied on agriculture at this time to provide for themselves and their families, and knowing this, we begin to understand why 88% of that black population was actually enslaved. In a mostly agrarian society, those that could afford to pay the one-time fee for indefinite free labor through a slave had a significant advantage over those that could not. And something you don't really hear much about when discussing this slavery topic is the increase in social status a person gained when they owned a slave. The dream scenario, though, was not just to have multiple slaves, but instead have a large population of good-looking, hard-working, obedient servants. And since they could be purchased and sold like any other possession, they were treated as valued to some degree, but only in the way that one would value a nice horse. Incredibly useful and certainly worth protecting, but ultimately disposable. 19th century writer and abolitionist Fanny Kemble explained this disposability idea really well. With her husband being a slaveholder himself, she concluded after years of first-hand experience that the chief aim of slaveholders was to get as much out of their slaves, while also spending as little on them as possible. Albeit subtle, the image shown here is indicative of this disposability attitude, and we see the same idea shown in some popular media, like 12 Years a Slave.
Y'all gonna be in a cutting game. Very simple. I want you to take your knife, get in them cane, make it sing. Take the cane out, cut my tops, clean the shucks off, throw it on a pile for the planting game. Nah. Them cane ain't gonna jump up and bite you. Don't shy back. Rush it, boys, rush it!
Now this clip is really interesting because just like the image before it, the idea of disposability is on full display here. You see, sugarcane is notorious for its sharp leaves, and one small cut could turn into a potentially life-ending infection. Consider the medical advancements of the 19th century, and then consider the social position of the enslaved man and woman, and disposability becomes a much more practical idea to understand in this context. It follows that the enslaved were viewed as something closer to livestock or tools than people, and once this humiliating social rank was forced on them, the logic was very simple for white slaveholders. You would not take your ox to the vet during the antebellum period, nor would you excessively toil to fix a broken plow, so why make the effort to seek medical care for the slave's infected wound? But what was the purchasing process actually like? Well, the best way to know this is to look at primary sources. In other words, we look at what people have said in the past about a particular time to understand what that time was actually like. Before we dive into our primary sources though, we need to look at some important language. First, chattel. Chattels are things to be bought and sold. They're personal possessions to be owned. Next, buck. A buck is a contemptuous or scornful term for a black man, usually an enslaved one. And lastly, wench. This is a very disrespectful term to be applied to a woman, and as you expect in this context, a black enslaved woman. You wouldn't want your mother or your sister or your grandmother to be called a wench. Now with that established, let's look at some primary sources to see what this process of buying and selling humans was actually like. Our first primary source is an 1829 poster advertising several things. And honestly, it reads more like a music festival poster than what you'd expect from an advertisement, with the clear headliners being slaves. But rather than being celebrated for their talent or creative ability, They're instead celebrated for their physical capabilities as purchased workers. From top to bottom, this entire advertisement tells a story of its own. Look carefully at this section here, listing Hannibal, William, and Nancy for sale. Now look even closer at the fine text just beneath the names. Almost like a hidden subliminal message, we are reminded of our chattel term when we see that Hannibal and William were actually Hannibal and William Leach, while Nancy was actually Nancy Smith. Now keep in mind that traditionally the enslaved were made to take the last name of whoever owned them, making them the owner's property both in law and in name. This is why Black Americans, even today, have a difficult time tracing their ancestry. And it's also why you see prominent Black figures, especially from the Nation of Islam, replace their surnames with X's and adopt more Islamic preferred names like Malcolm Little becoming Malcolm X and Cassius Clay becoming Muhammad Ali. Now most people just don't know these things, but it's yet another example of what seemed to be distant history following us still. But going back to our advertisement, on this next section we can see an even bigger lineup of people for sale, ranging from age 14 to age 40. On the list, we see names like Lucy, who is said to have experience in housework, likely cleaning, cooking, making beds, doing laundry, and things like that. She's said to be of good character, and really when you combine all of these things, it wouldn't surprise me to hear that this woman was a wet nurse. William was owned by the Bagleys. He was a young servant, but unlike Lucy, there is no attempt to even describe his character traits. This is expected. It's really difficult to find character traits communicated about the enslaved unless they were directly relevant to the work that they were needed for. Remember, the concern was located in what they could be used for, not what they were like. Williams listed as a laborer, and since he was a young man, he was more than likely a field hand. But we're still only left to speculate about who he really was. Jack was the property of the Antonia family, and immediately his age stands out. A slave in his 40s was well past his prime, so despite his ability or time spent with this particular family, the Antonias were likely trying to get him off their hands and purchase a younger, more physically capable man. The average life expectancy for an antebellum period slave was somewhere between 20 and 22, while the average antebellum white life expectancy was nearly double that. And now obviously infant mortality was an extremely common issue at the time, but either way, it's still scary to see such a massive discrepancy in life expectancy in any capacity. To round up this piece of especially ugly history, we see that at the bottom of this poster, common goods like books and ribbons are being sold. I think this portion kind of speaks for itself, but it surely rounds out this chattel idea. Real people with real lives juxtaposed to everyday items. Very ugly history. I recognize a few of the names of the enslaved and discuss them briefly to give them a moment to be personified or humanized. Tremendous effort was placed into keeping them several pegs below the title of even man or woman. From birth to death, they were never considered people, so to me, even speculating about what they may have been like is important. We read about the horrific status of the American slave, who was commonly written in to be placed in wills from fathers to sons, penciled in to be advertised like in the poster we just looked at, and labeled assets to be sold in the event of debt. Like when planter Pierce Meese Butler in 1859 sold over 400 slaves in just a couple days, primarily to pay off gambling debts. Yes, gambling debts, and one of the largest slave auctions in American history known as the Weeping Time. Remember Fanny Kimball from earlier? Well, Mr. Butler was her husband. No wonder she had so much to say about the slavery issue. And why wouldn't she? While not every auction was as large as Butler's, these advertised humans for sale, often with several other items surrounding them, were not at all uncommon, nor are they difficult to even find in the 21st century with a simple Google search. Here's one selling several bucks alongside a couple of winches, one with a 6-month-old baby, who was apparently not even worth the simple label of infant or child. Here's another one where 2 men are for sale, unsurprisingly listed just above livestock and furniture. And here's another one, this one especially heartbreaking, where a little black girl is up for sale as personal property. One of the main attractions even, just above some livestock and some other common goods. There's so many topics I had to skip over for the sake of time, like slaves' personal accounts of their experiences at slave auctions, the curse of Ham, and so many other things. But listen, if you enjoyed this video and you want more content like it, leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what you thought in the comments. Thank you.